World leaders have agreed an 11th-hour deal on climate finance at the COP29 summit in Azerbaijan. Wealthier countries have pledged $300 billion a year by 2035 to help poorer nations tackle climate change. But there wasn't universal support for the deal, with the Indian delegation calling the figure a paltry sum. Just hours before, it looked like the talks were on the verge of collapse after a group representing underdeveloped and lower-lying nations walked out of the conference room. They eventually came back to the negotiating table, but were angered by the offer from wealthier nations, which was far short of the $500 billion they wanted. From Baku, here's our climate editor, Justin Rolat.
It was in the early hours of this morning when the key text was agreed. To huge applause from the room. This deal was hard fought. At one stage, the talks looked set to collapse. Representatives of dozens of the world's least developed countries stormed out of a key meeting.
We've just walked out. We came here to this COP for a fair deal. We feel that we haven't been heard, and there's a deal to be made, and we have not been consulted.
At the same time, there was an effort by a group of fossil fuel-rich countries, led by Saudi Arabia, to water down a promise made at last year's COP conference to transition away from fossil fuels. The final deal here includes both a $300 billion a year commitment to helping developing countries tackle climate change and that strong language on cutting emissions.
I'm very pleased that we've got this deal through. It's the right thing for Britain. It's the right thing for speeding up the clean energy transition, which is good for Britain and it will help protect us against climate change, and that's the right thing to do. And it will also help generate jobs and growth for people in Britain. It's an 11th hour deal at the 11th hour for climate and for keeping 1.5 degrees alive. It's the right thing to do for Britain and the right thing for the world.
Some people are saying this deal isn't generous enough, that developed nations are dodging the debt they owe the developing world. Others are saying it shows that despite the divisions, despite Donald Trump threatening to pull America out of the process, the world can come together in this cooperative UN effort to tackle the existential threat of climate change. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Baku.
Well, as we've heard, there's been a mixed reaction to the deal. The Indian representative at COP29 said they had strong reservations to the agreement and accused developed countries of being unwilling to fulfil their financial obligations to the rest of the world. Here's their delegate, Chandni Raina.
This document is nothing more than an optical illusion. This, in our opinion, will not address the enormity of the challenge we all face. Therefore, we oppose the adoption of this document. We oppose the adoption of this document. India opposes the adoption of this document, and please take note and regard of what we have just said from the floor of this room.
Henna Hundal, National Coordinator of Climate Live USA and COP29 delegate who's just returned from Baku, shared her thoughts on the deal.
You know, I think it's a complex situation. On the one hand, you have about 198 parties having to come together, have 2 weeks to reach a consensus. This includes parties whose economies are driven primarily by fossil fuels and others whose economies are being destroyed by fossil fuels. So the fact that you can even get an agreement out of that type of a heterogeneous group is actually quite extraordinary and something to celebrate. At the same time, we know that this agreement has fallen quite short of what we know was actually needed. Economists had estimated that we actually need $1 trillion of climate finance by 2030, $1.3 trillion by 2035, about half coming from the public sector, half coming from the private sector, and this has fallen quite short of that. So I think there's room to celebrate, but also room to recognize that we have much more work to do.
The German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock described these talks as the last stand by the fossil fuel world. Do you think that that's a fair description?
I think we've certainly have seen a lot of fossil fuel lobbyists who attend these conferences, and that's been a point of concern among many people. It's also a matter of these conferences structurally involve bringing multiple parties and people and those with different interests around the table. It's really a very wide net that you're casting. And so it can be quite challenging to reach an agreement when you have all these people coming with different ambitions, visions, agendas, and goals. And to finally reach something like even $300 billion of climate finance is something worth celebrating. But I think there's definitely room for improvement here, and certainly really taking a hard look at the role of the fossil fuel industry and potentially having a role at these talks is something that we need to do for sure.
How much was the absence of key leaders and countries represented here making? How much difference did that make to the mood and the momentum at the COP29?
Well, I think it's undeniable that President-elect Donald Trump is returned to office next year, casted a long shadow over the proceedings of the conference. I mean, I heard talk about that both overtly and tacitly. People are sort of writing off the United States participation for the next 4 years. It was kind of stunning to witness, given that I was there at COP26 in Scotland in 2021, when then President Biden's climate envoy, John Kerry, played a crucial role in negotiating the final deal that was reached in the 11th hour. So I think the United States' role is really coming into question. We also saw French President Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, the Japanese Prime Minister, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau also not make face. And I think that's important to think about, is there enough political will to actually execute on the pact that was reached? I think that remains an open question.
And much of the money that's supposed to be delivered here is actually going to come from the private sector, isn't it? How likely is it to actually materialise?
I think that's something we need to keep our eye on. I mean, it's certainly important. If we look at, for example, the Loss and Damage Fund, last year at COP28 in Dubai, millions of dollars were pledged by countries for that fund, which was designed to provide developing countries with money to specifically navigate the extreme weather disasters that they're facing that are causing so much destruction and devastation. And we've seen only a fraction of that money actually materialize. So I think that's probably one reason why the conference extended into overtime in the manner that it did and was particularly fraught, because not only do we need to reach the numbers, those climate finance numbers that the economists are telling us, but we have to make sure that these are not empty promises. And so I think there's certainly that sentiment felt among a lot of people, and increasingly so as we watch some of these promises not quite materialize over the years.